Hi everybody and welcome to this afternoon. Today we're going to be doing a panel discussion. We're going to be looking at the challenges and opportunities facing the waterways. I'm Paul Knox-Johnston from Haven Knox-Johnston. I'm going to be chairing it and asking the general question, but I'm very happy to be joined by a panel of experts that we have here today. Matthew Symonds, the Head of Boating and Customer Service Support at the Canal and River Trust. Charlie Norman, Director of Campaign and Public Affairs at the Inland Waterways Association. Tiffany Gale-Haynes, owner of Enslow Marina and partner in the Kingsground Narrowboat. And of course, our host, Peter Johns of Waterways World, publisher and Crick Boat Show director. Now, we put out a couple of emailers prior to the show and we received some really great responses from everybody and in advance. So I've tried to make a selection to cover the widest possible range of topics. And my apologies if we have not been able to include your question. To try and keep us on track to answer as many questions as possible, I'm going to read out the questions myself, but the opportunity will be there if the question setter is in the audience and wants to jump in. Having said that, we do have a number of anonymous questions where the questioner did not want to be named. And we start with one of those, which is, I'm unsure why, it's because it's actually a great question. And we'll go down the panel line with, what are the biggest changes you have seen in the waterways during your involvement with them? If we start with you, Matthew.
It's a great question. Well, I've worked for the Trust for 14 years in boating all that time, and I think the biggest change I've seen is the change in use of boats. So we're definitely seeing more people now choosing to live on boats on the water, and a slight reduction in people using them just for leisure use, but still that is the biggest use on our waterways. And I think the other thing I would highlight is certainly since COVID, how people have discovered the waterway. So it isn't just boating, although more people are boating, but we're getting more people walking and cycling and fishing and doing stand-up paddleboarding. And that's great. You know, it's fantastic that people want to be on the water, but of course it brings a bit of a challenge as we have to manage the conflicts and the competing uses.
Thank you. And Charlie?
I'm a list person, so I've just jotted down 4. I'm just going to cross out 2 because you said it. So those 3. I suppose it depends whether I think about it in terms of my love of rivers or my paid position to think about rivers and canals. So I try and put it a bit in the middle. I think it's a changing climate. The amount of closures last year because of the low water. We can't get away from the fact that the whole world is changing and we're seeing those changes happen in our country. Stoppages are up. I'd have to add to that the precarity of funding. 75% of canals are unsecured, and we weren't particularly worried about that about 10 years ago. We conscious of it, but not worried about it particularly. And I think maybe what I would say is we have to get to a point where we see rivers and canals as being of equal value, and both of them as part of critical infrastructure. And I think that's starting to change, actually, certainly from a parliamentary point of view. And I think that's a possibility, actually. So yes, absolutely a changing climate, the amount of stoppages we saw last year, but a recognition that we shouldn't compete. Canals and rivers shouldn't compete with each other. I think that's a good thing.
Fantastic, thank you. And Peter?
Yeah, I sort of got involved in this world 30 years ago. I became publisher of Waterways World, and I tend to see things in the prism of boating as much as anything. And I think during that period, I'm slightly worried that we've seen the peak of leisure boating. And as Matthew said, there's been that big shift to residential boating. Whenever I talk to people outside of the waterways, they all assume that if you've got a narrowboat, you live on it. I did a radio interview last night with Radio Northampton, and he just couldn't get his head round the fact that anybody would use a boat for anything other than living aboard. But having said that, as Matthew said, we've seen that trend, and what I call leisure boating, which is people will have a boat, it'll moor in a marina, and you'll go out 2, 3, 4, 5 times a year, or perhaps on an extended cruise one year and not the next. That sort of leisure boating, I think, has peaked and may never come back. You've got that shift on residential boating, and that is reflected in some analysis I did of the lockage movement data that the CRT can provide, that shows since COVID, and maybe starting just before, that the actual use of boats as boats rather than houses or homes, that has started to decline. And there's some fairly big implications in that. Yes, many other changes, but for me, in my prism as boat show director, publisher of Waterways World, that has been a huge change over the last 30 years.
And finally, Tiff.
Hello, good afternoon. So we've got a little marina in Oxfordshire and we build boats, so we see both sides of that. But the biggest changes I've seen in 20 years are the decline of the infrastructure, which brings in more closures, but also a definite shift in who owns boats and who comes to us to build boats for them. And it definitely has gone into more liveaboards rather than leisure. So, and I think some of that is the costings now of what it is to run a boat when it's for pure leisure rather than living aboard, which is more sort of cost effective given the climate with houses and things.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we've got quite a wide range of sort of backgrounds and interests there. So we're getting quite a good range of answers coming through. The second question has come in from Terry Cavender from the Buckingham Canal Society, who is the Buckingham Canal Society Executive Officer, and sort of takes a look into the future in that what do the panelists see as reason for canals to exist over the next 200 years? Surely water transfer and storage is the critical given path. And then in quotes, the EA predict by 2055 we will be 5 billion litres of water short every day, quoted in the Times 28th of March 2026. Is not the reinvention of canals as the UK water grid vital to see us through climate change, limit drought impact and achieve flood betterment? So I'll start again with you, Matthew, on that one.
Yes, definitely. Canals have huge potential to address so many of the issues and challenges that we are experiencing, particularly around climate change. So Terry mentioned water transfer. Well, our canals already do that. I happen to live in Bristol, and half of the drinking water for Bristol comes via the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal. You might be aware of the Grand Union Water Transfer Scheme, which there is. I'll give a plug for my colleague Peter Walker, who's giving a talk on that tomorrow at 12:30 in the masterclass, I think, tent. Another example of how that scheme will again move drinking water from the Midlands to the south east, where there's huge demand, but it has huge benefits for others as well. So to do that, you've got to improve the infrastructure, invest in it, and to move the water companies will pay the trust money to do that. So we can reinvent canals to make different use of them. They can also, provide cooling mechanisms. We already have our waterways used for cooling data centres, where they take water out, cool, put it back in. In Bristol, where I live, the harbour actually has a water source heat pump attached to it, which is heating and providing hot water for 150,000 homes. So, canals have fantastic benefits, and I think we'll see people we're already starting to see people realise they can provide some of the solutions to the challenges we've got to address around climate change. So there's a bright future, I think. Not at the expense of navigation, I should say. It's not either or, it's both.
Excellent, thank you. And Charlie?
I almost want to hear the question again. I think it answered itself. Like, yes. We got that. Yes. We have fed in strongly, quite robustly at first, actually, about the Grand Union. And I believe there was a response to our submission just last night. It's a shame I was in that ale tent, but I will read it. And I'm sure that our considerations were taken into strong account. Supporting ecosystems, preserving heritage, we essentially take the view that it's a sensible thing to do. We don't go so far as to say it's absolutely the answer everywhere. Properly monitored, properly investigated, we think that they absolutely have their place. And they're not new, they've been going on for a while. And I think the astonishing thing to a layperson, people don't understand, well, they're not very good sometimes at talking about what you do, that your drinking water can come from moving water around the network. And we've seen just on the back of the Climate Change Committee report in the last 10 days, news headlines all of a sudden at the moment are about keeping the taps running. The taps don't go dry. Just about old enough to remember it used to be keeping the lights on, which is a very loaded phrase, but now we're genuinely talking about really worrying water shortages. So we're absolutely of the view that when done properly, when considered citation, these schemes have their best and can be very much a meaningful part of climate initiation.
Peter?
Yeah, again, really interesting question, and there's a very simple answer to in one sense, yes, move on, but of course, water transfer, yeah, great, but what it highlights to me, and I think that was actually hinted in the question, that what the waterways are. I'm telling the publisher, I'm checking my grammar as I speak. Whatever. The waterways are a network. And whether that's water transfer, whether it's leisure boating, whether it's wildlife corridors or whatever, but they've always been a network. They started out as a network to ship industrial products and raw materials around the place. And then you had that long period of decline, and you came back with leisure boating, which was, a lot of that was hire fleets, and then into private leisure boating and so on. And this is just another iteration of that. And I think I'm right that it's not just, in infrastructure terms, not just water transfer, but great routes, fibre optic cables, for example. So if you see this, you look at the map of the waterways, it's a network, it connects things. If that network can be used to generate income, whether it's fibre optic cables, whether it's boats, whether it's wildlife corridors, if that generates the income to keep them alive, then great, bring it on.
And Tiff.
Thank you. I think we all know that the canals are more than just navigation alone. I think that one of the questions that comes with this is, has the setup for funding included all of that? So can we do it all? And most importantly, from my point of view and boaters' points of view, is, are we being communicated with so that we understand it? And, you know, we don't know the ins and outs because we're not educated from that point of view. But maybe actually if we were, you know, given the benefit of more information, we might be more understanding of what's going on and how it all works.
Excellent. Is Terry here, for any chance? Hi, Terry. Is that satisfied you? Is there any follow-up questions on that?
Yes, several people know me, and yeah, I think the question was there to provoke conversation. Maybe the conversations will continue afterwards. But your point, the editor there is the most important one about communicating with everybody what it is, what it means, what it doesn't mean, those kind of aspects. But bottom line is, if we don't want water coming out of the taps, we're not going boating.
Peter?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm just trying to pick up on that communication thing. It's a huge time of change, and so the challenge is for all the roads involved to get that communication right. We hear the stories about canals are more than leisure boating. It's about nature and wildlife, but we've got to be careful not to compartmentalise those. I think that's a big part of what you're both saying. Don't look, and I think I was trying to say, but you've perhaps articulated it better than I. Don't look at things in compartments. Let's get away from being too boating focused or too wildlife focused and look at it through those narrow lenses. How does it all join up? And back to my comment about it's a network, and that brings with it many, many more opportunities in my mind.
And Matthew?
I was just going to add, if people want to find out a bit more about the Grand Union Water Transfer scheme and they're not here tomorrow and Pete's giving his talk, we do have some panels in our Canal and River Trust tent. You can read a bit more information. There has been a huge amount of engagement and consultation on the scheme. It's getting very close to going for formal planning stages. And one of the benefits of the scheme is that it will probably deliver lots of other additional benefits, whether that's improved moorings or facilities. So there is benefits that will directly benefit boaters as well as the improved resilience of the canal.
Fantastic. Anything, Jerry?
I'll leave with my Rubik's Cube. For those who know my Rubik's Cube, it has 6 sides. Water has 6 sides. Water transfer is one side of the canals along the others. They are indeed joined up to make a cube.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that. The next question comes from David Matthews, and it's probably a question more directed at you, Matthew, as it's pertinent to our location. Speaking with a very conscientious long-term CRT volunteer at Foxton Locks in 2023, he said that BW or CRT had not carried out any proper maintenance on the GU Leicester line for 20 years. The depth of the water has decreased due to the 20 years plus build-up of silt, making mooring on this stretch impossible for many.
That's definitely one for me, I think. Okay, so I'm a bit surprised by that because I know there's certainly been lock replacements and brick repairs and maintenance carried out on our winter works programme over the last couple of years on the Leicester line, and I'm sure there's been many more over the last 20 years as well. Clearly, it's no surprise to anyone, we have a very large network of 2,000 miles. We spend about 180 million on our charitable activities. The vast majority of that is on maintenance, on big winter works projects, on day-to-day management, on investment in our reservoirs. It's spent on keeping the canals open and available for everyone to use. We do have to prioritise where we spend it, which there's never enough to go on with. Why we need to raise more money, get more commercial income, volunteers, donations, income from lots of different streams. But I would say that we definitely prioritise what our boaters tell us as well. We asset inspect everything. We give everything a score. We have to prioritise on that. But then we listen to our boating customers who tell us, you know, this is a problem area. So it's really important for people to give us that feedback. We are working to make it easier to give us that feedback. We're developing a boaters app, which will make it easier to report faults. On facilities, on locks, on bridges, on fallen trees, those sort of things. And that should be, touch wood, fingers crossed, available later this year. But it's important for people to tell us. We definitely have invested in the Leicester line. If I had had more notice, I could have given you a list of, could get that information. But there's more that we need to do, and we need other people's support to help us do that.
You want to chip in?
Yes.
You talked about volunteering, and the CRT website describes volunteers as the backbone of the charity. Without tireless work, skills and dedication, you just couldn't function. Can you explain, please, why a volunteer task force who spent 3 years maintaining and improving a scheduled ancient monument by contributing 5,625 hours of their time, equating to around £71,500 if we'd been paid minimum wage, why that task force has now been discontinued because the trust have decided not to continue to provide basic amenities such as toilet facilities and shelter.
Okay, well, without knowing the specific details, I can't honestly answer that, and I'm happy to look into that and explain that. I do know that in terms of facilities, because people will be aware, we're having to make difficult choices, and we have decided not to provide toilets and showers across the network going forward. But as part of that work, we have worked with all of our regional teams to identify sites where colleagues and volunteers need access to toilets, and we developed a list and have maintained toilets for those people to use. So I'm not sure why that one's been missed off the list, if that's the reason why they're not containing that task force. But if you want to have a chat afterwards, I'm happy to look into it for you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments on that from the panel?
It's perhaps interesting, you just mentioned about the donations that come in. From the people that I talk to, the leisure boaters have decided in large numbers that they don't want to donate anymore. Is that something that you're aware of yourself and you've seen decline?
No, and it's kind of counter to what we're seeing. So we're seeing an increase in friends, including boating friends, joining up to make those regular donations. We're seeing a big increase in people making legacy gifts as well, and particularly from boaters. So that isn't my experience and what the figures are telling us. I think there will be some people, I know I talk to them, and that aren't happy with everything we do. But I also talk to lots of people who are very supportive and do give us their time, their money, their legacies. So we're seeing that growing year on year. Our volunteer numbers have grown again this year as well. So it's not been reflecting what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just a couple of comments from me. I tend to see things in shades of grey rather than black and white. Things change all the time. If there's less boating going on, there's going to be less facilities because there's less demand for it. It's a change, and if you're a traditional boater, you're not going to like it. Of course you're not. Of course you want better facilities, but if the fund, as I suppose Matthew's saying, if the funding's not there, where do you make those choices? Those choices have to be made, and that I think people have heard me on this hobby horse before, that sometimes those at a national level, those are choices about whether we have more hospitals or more police or whatever. Those choices happen at every single level, and it's tough, and tough decisions have to be made. Whether everybody agrees, of course not everybody's going to agree with them. It's tough, and it is a nearly 250-year-old network. It will go wrong. Is it going wrong more often? I suppose that's the question I'd throw back at Matthew. Is it going wrong more often now than it did 20 years ago? I've no idea.
The question, is it going wrong? Well, year on year, we're seeing more unplanned stoppages. I mean, it's part of the pressure the waterway's on. I mean, last week I was wearing a jumper. Today we're sitting here in the over 30 degrees. Imagine what that's doing to 250-year-old canals, and that's happening all the time. We're getting extreme weather storms, we're getting extreme droughts. So it's putting a lot of pressure on infrastructure was never designed with that in mind. So yes, it's a problem and it's a challenge. We're trying to rise to address that challenge. If I could just come back on the facilities, because it would be amiss of me to say, although we are closing toilets and showers, we're reinvesting that money back into standardising and improving our water points, our Elsons, our refuse facilities, and our pump out machines. So it's not we're just taking the money away, we're putting it back in what boaters told us this is what we think you should prioritise.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Very interesting debate on there. The next one comes in from David Williams. A number of boaters move from a home mooring to continuous cruising during the licence period. What system does the trust have in place to manage that transition smoothly, ensure the correct licence category and fees are applied, and avoid any unintended loss of revenue? And talking to fellow boaters, even when they proactively notify the trust, changing licence status can be tricky. And the advice can be to attend to it when they come to relicense, which could be up to a year later. And then there's a follow-up question, which is intended for me, I think. Does a licence category have any impact on a boater's insurance? I'll come on to that, but do you want to pick up on the first point? I'm
happy to pick up the first one, although I feel sorry for my fellow panellists. It's a bit of a one-on-one interview, this, not a panel. That's good. So I think the question is interesting, but it's not reflected in what we're seeing. Now, first of all, is it hard to change your mooring status? It shouldn't be. Most people manage their mooring information, their license themselves. Over 80% do it online, self-serve. If you go from a home mooring to a continuous cruiser, yes, you should tell us. But if you don't, because we have sighting rangers covering the network every 14 days, if we see boats that are on the network that are never on a mooring and it says they've got a mooring, then over time we will go to them and say, do you still have your mooring? And we will check. Because now, since we've introduced the surcharges for boats without a home mooring, then they have to pay a little bit more on top. But what we're actually seeing is the number of boats that are continuously cruising. We're not meant to use that word anymore, according to our Boat Licence Commission, but that's what everyone uses. We're seeing that go up, but we're not seeing the number of boats with home moorings decline significantly, which is what you'd expect to see. And what we think has happened since we've introduced that surcharge is, as part of that process, you have to provide evidence of having a permanent mooring. And there's probably quite a lot of boats who maybe have been on unofficial moorings that don't have permission from us, are not paying a contribution for having a permanent mooring. So they can't provide the evidence, so they're having to pay the surcharge, which is why we're seeing more boats, continuous cruisers, paying that surcharge. So it's actually rectified an issue of a lot of people claiming to have an official mooring but not actually having an official mooring because they can't provide the evidence of having that mooring there.
Yes, Charlie.
So IWA, we're 80 this year. We campaigned for the retire 5,000 miles, but we're not an authority. We're not a navigation authority. We don't have to deal with licenses. As somebody who does live on a boat and has owned many boats over the years and pays my license, speaking perhaps just a little bit personally, you have groups of people, you have rules, and there will always be some. And of course, we're going through this bit of an ache at the moment with the Commission and looking at findings, looking at recommendations, what's going to change. People don't necessarily always like change, they're nervous about it, but just broadly speaking, as a principle, you do need to follow the rules. And we absolutely fully support people following the rules. It's not necessarily easy for some people. They might need additional help to understand what the rules are, but the rules must be clear and they must be consistent. So I just think that there is a principle that applies, because if people aren't particularly versed, I suppose, in the world of boats, they think it's somewhat freewheeling and drop out and unmonitored, and what a lovely hippie life that, you know. There are rules, and they need to be followed, and the rules exist so that we have a navigable waterway system that does work for us all. Yeah.
Tiff?
Yeah, I think that we all want the same thing. We all want the waterways to be, you know, wonderful stretches of water for the next generation, and that takes time and costs a lot of money. And so from a marina point of view, I know there are people with home mooring codes that do not moor with me, and I know they haven't for quite some time, and that's not been addressed. And I know people have called and tried to sort it out, and that's not been good. And what we don't want is for you to lose money, because that money is needed. And so it's not an attack saying you've not done it properly. It's more so that we want to put that money in the pocket so it can be spent wisely to protect our waterway.
So, you know, if people do it between licenses, there is always going to be an element of you not, unless people tell us and declare that, it's very hard to always capture. As I say, our sighting regime means if we're continually seeing you not on a mooring, we will start to pick up people who are on the canal and say they've got a home mooring. But of course, there are people with home moorings, but that's perfectly legitimate, and they're just cruising away from their mooring. So it is a balance of how much money do you put into that, where it costs more than the money you're going to get back. So I think we've got the balance about right. And as I said, we are getting an increased amount of continuous cruisers paying the surcharge because people who have claimed to have home moorings are not. And I think that's the bigger issue than the people who are switching from home moorings to continuous cruising generally.
Definitely. I just wonder what it does for communication for the ones that rang up and tried to be honest, and then they got told to do it on the next one. And we see that, we hear that, we get that feedback. But if you call them and then say, we've cited you here, there and everywhere, they're going to feel like they've done something wrong when they haven't, they tried.
So I would really love to know more details, if anyone can provide me with more details, because we record phone calls to our customer service teams, we track all our emails, so we can look into those conversations if I know when and who it was. So if there's more information, I'm very happy to look into that.
Fantastic. And just a brief one on the insurance subject. It does have an effect. If you're changing from having a marina berth or a home mooring going to continuous cruising, you will have to inform your insurance company, and the premium may be affected. Certainly if you're coming from a marina berth, because if your home mooring is a marina berth, there are certain insurance companies who will give benefits for being moored in a marina. And the minute that's no longer your home base, then then the premium will change. So just let your insurance company know, and they'll be more than happy to update your policy on that basis. The next question comes from Ian Palfreyman. And this is a very good question, because it's something that we're seeing nationwide from an insurance perspective, in the fact that the question is, what is the solution to the ever-growing number of abandoned, sunken or unseaworthy boats on the waterways? And again, this is something we're not just seeing on the inland waterways. We're seeing it on the coast, we're seeing it on the rivers, we're seeing it everywhere. There are boats that are just left on beaches, on moorings, that are just slowly deteriorating. But we're going to talk specifically about rivers and canals now. So, Peter, do you want to take this one first?
I was hoping you'd give me a bit of time to think about that one.
Oh, no.
Slightly different perspective on it, I suppose. I've often wondered, we always get asked how many boats are being built a year. There's not really much data on it. We've got license data that we can look at from CRT and from the other navigation authorities. Doesn't tell you the complete picture. And part of what it doesn't tell you is what happens to old boats. Yes, some of them do get abandoned, but where do old boats go when they die? Isn't it the question about elephants or something like that? Where do elephants go to die? I don't know where boats go to die. Given how many boats have come onto the system, the number's doubled over the last 30 years, I think, maybe slightly more. That's a hell of a lot more, but they don't get abandoned. And I suppose a corollary of that is, well, people always ask, does the boat keep its value? Well, no, it doesn't, but it's not like a car. It's somewhere between a house and a car, isn't it? That if you buy property, you've got a house, it's your biggest asset, it appreciates. If you've got a car, it only goes one way. You've lost several £1,000s the moment you left the showroom. If you're like me and you're an idiot and you drive it into the ground, then it eventually collapses and it's worth. No, a boat somewhere in between. If you maintain it well, it's got a very, very long lifetime. So perhaps actually there aren't quite as many abandoned boats as you think, and that's partly what's driven that rise in numbers. That's speculation, but perhaps others have some evidence that there are lots of sunken abandoned boats.
And Charlie?
Evidence, I was just going to go for an anecdote, so I don't have evidence. Do you have evidence?
Do we have evidence of sunken abandoned boats? Or, well, from the Canal and River Trust point of view, we know this is a problem. We know it's a problem that bothers other boaters as well. And we are putting extra money into our budgets this year to remove more sunken boats from our network. We estimate there's around about 120 across our waterways, across our 2,000 miles. Probably more abandoned. Abandoned is a bit harder to establish abandoned. One of the challenges we've got is identifying whose boats they are, because they're often unlicensed. I mentioned the Boat Licensing Commission that we established, and they've made a couple of recommendations around this. And one of them is there being a register of boat owners nationally, because we have to spend a lot of time to try and identify whose boat it is before we can remove it, because you have to go to reasonable measures to try and contact them, to give them the chance to remove a boat before you remove it, and ideally make them pay to remove the boat so we don't have to. We have to go through all that process, and then ultimately we'll have to remove it anyway, particularly if it's causing a navigation obstruction, and then we'll have to dispose of it. So we're spending tens of thousands of pounds addressing this issue. So knowing who's owning who the boats belong to would be one solution. Another recommendation the Commission made was to look at insurance or salvage bonds. So there is a clearer kind of thing associated to the cost of removing sunken boats, so that it doesn't get passed on to us. So there are some ways forward potentially, but it is a challenging issue for us.
If I just jump back in there, I think that is really useful number. If it's 120 and there are 34,000 licensed boats, it's not a huge problem. It may be if it's on your waterway and there are 2 or 3 of them and it's causing you a problem. But nationally, 120 out of 33,000, it's not huge numbers, in my view.
And Charlie?
You said you dispose of the boats. Do you actually give a bit more detail there?
So the question, in case everyone can't hear, do we dispose of the boats? So yes, if there's a value in them, we obviously would try and resell them. But as you've probably seen, a lot of the sunken boats are not very valuable and no one would want them. And so we do have to pay for disposal costs. Yes, and we do work with them, and we have given some boats to forces afloat if there's a use for them. Yeah, so that's a really good scheme where they help to rehome veterans on boats and get them on the water.
And Charlie, I know you're on.
Yeah, no, it's so hot in here. I don't think you need me to pontificate. But I just want to say, I just feel bereft when I see a boat sinking. I just feel so sad and depressed, and I wonder what that boat's story is. What is the story of the person that did that? I find it completely heartbreaking. But just to comment on the work that I've done in the past on the psychology of littering, really it's kind of life-sharing littering. And the one thing that you can't do, and I find this astonishing, the thing you can't do is shame people into changing their behaviour. So I wonder if there's a way of looking at incentives to encourage people not to do that. But just I want to say I just feel very emotional when I see it's being abandoned. There's a story there, and it's probably not a good one.
Excellent. Tiff, then Matty.
I've not got an awful lot to add to this, except Matthew might not know, but our site is used to salvage boats on our stretch that don't have another life or a bit of life left in them. So, and we do get to see them often with harnesses that have been made to cradle them to come out with, because they're really not going to go anywhere else. So it is sad to see them come away, but it is necessary, and it is a long procedure, which I think we all appreciate, and it does cost money.
I was just going to throw in something that's a bit interesting and a new technology and how it can help us, because obviously ideally what we'd like is not to sink in the first place and get them out before they're a problem. And we have quite a high number of boats that we call unidentified on our waterways that haven't got a license or an index number. We don't know who the owner is. And we have photographs of all these boats from many years, and we've removed some, and we go through processes to deal with them. But we've been using AI recently to trial to see whether what it can tell us about those unidentified boats. So is it more of one particular type? And one of the things that we weren't expecting when we started using the AI technology to scan these photographs, it was giving us a percentage rate of how likely it was to sink. Without us asking it to do that, it started to tell us. And that's really interesting, because when we can then, if we can use that technology as soon as we see an unidentified boat, if it is higher risk of sinking, without us having to make an assessment, we can target and prioritize boats and deal with them before they sink. So there's a glimmer of hope there that we can use technology in an innovative way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I really wish there was a question on AI here, because that would be fascinating. I'm going to come to you first on this one, Charlie, but I'm going to give you a bit of time, and this is quite a long one. The canal network was originally built as freight infrastructure, yet today it is expected to deliver heritage preservation, flood management, biodiversity, leisure, tourism, and well-being factors. Should the waterways now be treated as critical national infrastructure rather than simply a heritage or leisure asset? And if so, should central funding come from multiple government departments rather than just the one?
Yes and yes.
Nice and simple. Matthew?
Oh, well, I agree. I'll try and expand a little bit more on that. But, you know, a big part of our job is to convince government of this message, and we tried very hard in our government grant settlement. We didn't get quite as much as we want, but we have got continued commitment to fund the waterways, which is something. But, you know, if you live in Edgbaston or Brent, you're sitting below quite a large reservoir. If you live in Burnley, you're sitting below quite a large embankment. This is critical infrastructure. If we don't maintain it and something goes wrong, then the consequences are quite serious. It's not just you haven't got somewhere nice to walk the dog or go for a canal boat. This is critical infrastructure. As I said earlier, it has the potential to do great things, but it's really important it's invested in and maintained properly and safely.
And Peter?
Yeah, I suppose that's the interesting point for me. It's that it requires that investment, but the broader question is that can't, I'm back on this topic, is it can't be just government funding. It can be government funding beyond DEFRA, and I know that there are other departments and ways that can be utilised and other funding because of those infrastructure needs, requirements, uses of the waterways. But I think we can't just always go back, well, let's have some more money from government. I think there are opportunities from private investment. We've talked about water transfer, and that will involve the water companies, which in the moment at least are privatised. Whether that will remain is a political question. And we talked about fibre optics networks, and one that we haven't really talked about is the development land potential alongside waterways. If you look at what's happened in Birmingham with all the development around Bromley Place, the waterside development property has huge value, and if that can be used to unlock, to create the investment to make the waterways around there more resilient to change, to climate change and other external factors, that's great. So I just would like to get away from just saying it's got to be from government, because the easy answer is, would everybody in this room like to see more government funding go into the waterways? Every hand will shoot up. If I say, would you all be prepared to see your taxes go up or your pensions down to fund it? The answer will be slightly different. So you've got to make those hard choices. I'm not trying to make an excuse for anybody, but you've got to face those realities. And I think there are some serious private sector opportunities to bring funding into the waterways.
And Tiff?
I think we all agree that the waterways, you know, they need some generational planning and not short-term solutions that are sticking plasters. Have we done enough with the funding that we had from the government in the time that we did have it? Or are we trying to chase our tails now that it's running out? And those are the issues that we're facing now. Is time's not on our side, and some of that brings some frustration, some questions, and again comes back to communication.
Charlie.
Just so that I have given a 3-word answer on this. We don't talk about money. We don't talk about asking government for money. I agree with Peter, that's not the way to go, but we talk the lifelong day about investment and the benefits that come from investment. And that just reframes that conversation, particularly in the parliamentary level. Investment pays off.
Brilliant. Anyone? No? I did actually now find a question on AI, so we will move into this. Could technology be used to reduce operational costs? For example, AI-assisted infrastructure monitoring, inspection drones, or predictive maintenance systems? Are there any particular tools which are being considered or currently used? I think, Matthew, if you can kick us off on that one.
So we already use some of these technologies. We use drones for inspecting assets. We're using remote technology to monitor water, and we'll be investing more in those kind of technologies. I think AI is obviously quite new for a lot of us, but it has huge potential to help us do more with more stretched resources, shall we say. But yes, it's definitely got a role to play, as I've highlighted in identifying unidentified boats for one. But there will be many ways it will play an increasing role in the future, I think.
Peter?
Not really much to add. It'd be astonishing if new technology can't provide some of the solutions or part solutions, AI being an obvious one, at least in monitoring assets. And I thought the examples you gave earlier about sunken boats, that was one small example. If that technology doesn't mean that the navigation authorities can't make better decisions about where maintenance is required, I'd be absolutely astonished if we don't get some real gains there. When they'll be, whether it's next year, 2 years, 5 years, I'm not sure, but there must be gains to be had.
Charlie?
Just an observation on drones, actually. The Bridgewater breach of January 1, the beginning of last year, had some astonishing amateur drone footage, which got incredible press coverage. And I think that the attention given to that story, because it's so visual, helped to draw attention not only to that breach, but to the risk across the rest of the network as well. So definitely we're seeing an amazing new way, I suppose, to communicate the network because of the incredible amateur drone footage that we're being given donated to, actually, almost every day. I appreciate it's different from AI. And we don't have a policy on AI. I'm thinking about it at the moment. I'm kind of terrified, but they are. But yeah, big fan of drone footage.
Did you want to come back?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we know it's going to have a huge impact. We don't know quite how yet. We just last week had someone join the trust who is a new innovation manager, who is looking at how we can use new technologies, do things differently, be imaginative, so we can actually do more with what we've got and get better results. So I think she's going to have a lot of exciting ideas over the coming year that you'll start to see emerge.
Brilliant. And Tiff?
I think I've been living under a rock, didn't know anything about this new technology. Can we have a little bit of a show of hands of who did know about the new technology? Not a huge amount. We'd love to know more, and I think it does help us be more supportive to the Canal and River Trust, knowing what's going on and what your ideas are for going forward. I don't know whether we need to maybe have a discussion going forward on how we can all be included in these things, because without having to go and find the information, how do you find it? How do we know how to find it if we don't know it exists? So
it is very early days at the moment, so you will definitely be hearing more about it. But as we're just trying to work out how best to use it, trialing different things, you'll be hearing more about how we're using it.
Well, it's fascinating and positive, and I think we'd all like to know as and when you know more. We'd love to know more, I'm sure. A
very simple example, and you probably may use this yourself. Since a lot of us are now remote working at the Trust, we work from home, we have a lot of meetings on Teams, and we record those meetings on Teams now, and as the meeting finishes, the AI tells you, these are the action points. these are a brief summary of what we were discussing. It tells you, Matthew said this, and so said that. It is incredible that it can do it in seconds, whereas previously, no disrespect to my colleagues who've done a fantastic job minuting meetings and producing minutes, that takes weeks to do often, and you go around and get people to check them. The AI is doing it in seconds. It's transformative.
Fantastic. I think we'll have one more question from the list I have in front of me, because I love this question. If the panel is sitting here again in 2050, what would success actually look like? A fully navigable network, a partially rewilded one, a commercially self-sustaining one, or simply a network that still survives at all? Start with you, Peter.
Why are you picking on me? As long as it's still here, I think that would be the first phase. As long as we don't close any waterways permanently, I think that would be success. I think real success would be utilising all of the opportunities we've talked about to use this absolutely unique network and use it in every single way. If we focus too much on boating, it won't work, because boating just cannot generate enough income to maintain that network. We've got to unlock all of the potential. Some of it is actually relatively simple. I would suggest the sort of water transfer, fibre optics and other cables, whatever. That sort of work is probably relatively simple. The hardest bit is, well, actually, nature and environment is not the hardest bit either, because that, if it exists, those wildlife corridors will be there. It's the cyclists, the walkers, the runners, the casual users. The network provides so much pleasure and entertainment for them, but it gets taken for granted. If we can capture that and get just a little slice of their commitment to the waterways, then I think the waterways could have a real exciting future.
Thank you, Peter. Charlie?
They will be here in 25 years. They were here 250 years ago. It's fine. The network will be here. How healthy will it be? That's up to us. But I think they have been a bit of a victim of their own success. We completely take it for granted. I'm just going to go back to something Matthew said at the beginning about those weird lockdown days when you want to go for a walk for an hour, that's all you do. People discovered their local waterway and they kept that up. There's actually increased awareness of how close a very large proportion of the population live near to a waterway, and that's why I think you have to do a better concert. They will be here in 25 years. It's up to us to make sure that their condition is thriving and not just living along.
Fantastic. Tiff?
I think success looks like handing over our waterways to the next generation and the one beyond in a much better state than we've found it in. I do think there's been so many improvements from a lot of the canals that I remember from when I was younger. So, it's easy to find the negative, but when you look back to what the canals were like in Manchester when I was growing up with shopping trolleys in and all sorts of things, then there's definitely been some bonuses and benefits from there. It's come a long way. We must never, ever lose sight of the fact that while we can't rely on the boaters to bring in enough income, they are what keeps the waterways alive, with whether you're holiday makers, whether you're leisure, whatever it is the hub. You are the people that make it feel alive. You are what keeps us so that we don't lose sight of what the waterways mean to us for that next generation and the one beyond and the one beyond. And we don't want to lose sight of that. And again, it comes back down to communication, that we want you to know how important you are to our waterways.
Sorry, can I just jump in again before I think we go to Matthew? Because I think that point, don't get me wrong about boaters. I think boating is absolutely 100% essential because it captures the essence of the canals. But my point is slightly different, that we can't rely on that alone. Without boats, they're not canals, I suppose is the simple bit.
And Matthew?
Well, I think often we think about the day-to-day problems that we're dealing with, we forget not so long ago, as Tiff's mentioned, the canals were not in as good a state as they're in now. I mean, I was at Cane Hill last week. Well, 50 years ago, Cane Hill was still closed and derelict. And it was because people were passionate and they cared that it was restored and it's open for us all to enjoy. And I think I'm optimistic that the canals can do all of those things that were on your list in future, and I'm optimistic they will, because we're living testament that there are people who care and love canals, and we're seeing, as Charlie said, more and more people finding canals on their doorsteps, finding the benefits from them and getting passionate about them too. So I'm really optimistic that the future is bright.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Do you want to do a couple? Yeah. We've got time for a couple of audience questions. If there's anyone who wants to ask anything to our panel, put your hands up. Oh, Rich at the back there.
Hiya. We've been continuously cruising, whatever it is I'm supposed to be as instead of continuously cruising, and touch a tree expression. And part of the reason we did this is because of our love of nature. And you've on the Canal really trust bet sites, and they're all about how they're guardians of 2,000 plus miles of canal river for nature. So why are we seeing the destruction of the natural habitats, and specifically my point on the Lost Sharp Nest Canal? Every year I'm apoplectic about the trimming and mowing that's going on. The destruction is just disgraceful.
Okay, happy to answer. I don't know if everyone heard the question. It was about grass being cut and wildlife biodiversity being cut back. So we have a big commitment to wildlife and to supporting nature corridors. We have ecologists that work for the Trust, but there is a balance that we have to make when we've got a navigation that is in use, and getting the balance of where you cut and where you don't cut. We have reduced some cutting in some areas, and so there will be reasons, I'm sure, why that decision's been made, but I'm happy to have a conversation afterwards with you and pick up with our teams on the ground who specify the grass cutting regime. But we do have increased over the years the amount of long grass we leave to support biodiversity, but it is about getting that balance right. If it's not quite right on your waterway, happy to have that conversation.
Could I just add to that? Sorry. I don't know whether you're aware of where we are, Matthew, at Enslow Marina. So along our stretch, and I've sent emails so you'll be able to find them. If you cut one way rather than the other, the grass would go more on the bank than in the water. And some of the time that you cut it, it's so long and it can get tangled around people's props because it's quite tough stuff. And we've seen it. And it's just that simple switch of going one way or the other. The other thing that doesn't always happen is you don't always check for nests and things. And we have had a case where a hold, a duck that was sat on a clutch was just completely macerated by a strimmer, which you are aware of. We sent an email through about that one. But it's just a little bit of consideration, and we're not asking for much, it's just little tweaks.
And those tweaks, we welcome that feedback because we can talk to our contractors and our contract managers around how we can improve those things. Absolutely commit to do that.
Yeah, a slightly different perspective on that from the show's perspective, actually. Just outside on Grand Union, where we use the moorings for visitors for the show, there has historically been a water vole population, and I've got to say this very carefully. The Trust has put some obstacles in my way in being able to manage those moorings for visitors who want to bring the boats to show to protect the water voles. So in operational terms, for me as a show organiser, it's actually causing problems because they've been too protective. I'm not saying I don't want them to be protective, but I think it's just an example where they have sided with nature, but sometimes I guess they don't for whatever reason.
With 2,000 miles, we're not necessarily going to get it right everywhere, but there's some fantastic examples of wildlife conservation going on across the network.
Charlie, did you want to come in on this?
I don't think we have a policy position on this. No.
Cool. We've got time for one more question. Oh, God. Eeny, meeny, money, man, isn't it?
Go for two.
Go for two. Okay, we'll go for the front.
Thank you. You talked about films not providing income to keep canals going. We all appreciate scientists use the canals quite a lot. One instance a few years ago, we brought up in Congleton, which is part of the Cheshire Ring. We got talking to our Phyllis Ladies, They don't have the whole fishing ring. They cycle the whole fishing ring in one day. That's another miles. That must have created some damage. You've got to find a way of getting down to contribute towards costs.
Just who wants to pick that one?
I mean, obviously we would like everyone to contribute. It's the balance of how do you do that where it becomes too onerous. You know, we don't want to have toll gates everywhere for cyclists and stuff. But we have in the past, British Waterways did have cycle permits and they got rid of them because they were too hard to administer and people weren't doing them. So there's definitely ways I think we need to get everyone to contribute, and our fundraisers are out on the towpath and they're talking to those people all the time as well. As part of the money that government gives us, so a key kind of part of that is access to the towpaths for people to walk and cycle. So it is part of the contribution we're getting from the government grant is to keep them open because they want it to be a healthy transport route as well. So, but absolutely, I would love more money from cyclists and walkers as well.
Yeah, I think I referenced that earlier. That is the biggest challenge. How do you police that and do it cost effectively? Because yeah, of course you could have a cycle permit requirement, but then you've got to police it. You've got to have a system and manage it. And if you put it too high, then nobody will cycle on them. They'll go off on other Suskans routes or whatever. And it'll become self-defeating. That for me, it remains for me the biggest challenge of how to monetize the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cyclists, walkers, runners who get all of that benefit, take advantage of it. How do you monetize that? Huge challenge. And part of it, I know what the part of the solution that the Trust has obviously developed is the fundraising aspect, and they're working very, very hard at it, but probably scratching the surface in truth of what it could be if you're talking about tens of millions of users and like that. How do you get more out of them?
Charlie?
Not everything needs to be monetized. However, speaking to your point earlier about government not being the only source of looking for funding to keep these things alive, it's right that these things are considered, but I think if you start to use the word policing, you might have lost the argument, or you might need to reframe it and assess slightly differently. You need to encourage people to want to be in those places and to actively want to contribute to their upkeep, not be made to see that it's a business case. So a little bit of I wouldn't say disagreement, but a little bit of a challenge point there for you, Peter.
I love disagreements and challenges, Charlie. You know that. You've sat in meetings with me long enough to know that.
Two.
That's really tricky, isn't it? Because I think part of the deal is with the government to keep them open for health and well-being, and
Yes.
we don't want to sort of rub them up the wrong way. But, you know, how do you police it? Probably quite tricky, but fundraising-wise, for the amount of money that you put in, do we see enough back?
The answer is yes, and we've got a 10-year plan to go from 6 million a year to 60 million a year. So we're setting quite stringent targets, and it is starting to pay dividends. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting more friends signing up. That is growing year on year now. More legacy gifts, more contactless donations. So it's not one. There's no one answer. It's lots of different ways of getting that money in, but it will take time. But it's starting to work.
Fantastic. We've got time for one more, do we think? One more. Let's go there.
So I think I'm actually interested in building on the conversation that you just had. I'm reasonably new to the Canal network, but what I see is that CRT for a long time said we've got X amount of money and it's not enough. But what I don't see is like a published, like commercial strategic direction of how we're going to fill that gap. And I guess I'm interested in why the CRT is being slow on commercialising their waterway network in a way that is done sustainably, is not done to detract from the waterways, but actually just to say, we know that this is our funding hole, how and are we going to publish how we're going to engage with businesses. I run a small business, and I happen to know that CRT haven't engaged in the TOMS network. But the TOMS network is a huge social value tool, which is being used by businesses on public sector tenders that the CRT aren't engaged in. So I'm interested in why those published commercial strategy. So this is how we're going to close the gap.
Okay. So we clearly do have commercial investments and a commercial strategy at the moment, but we are in the process of rewriting our organisational strategy with obviously a new chief executive. Campbell Robb joined us in October. He's starting to set out his direction, and generating more commercial income is a core part of that. I'm going to give a shameless plug. If you're here tomorrow at 3 o'clock, is it 3 o'clock? Campbell Robb will be in this seat, and he's much better placed to answer that question. So I'd encourage you to put that to him, but it's definitely on his agenda. We've got to generate more of our own money. We can't just be reliant on government grants and donations. So he's set very clear ambitions to our commercial director to come forward with, and it's a balance, because we're not doing this. We've got to maintain the network for boaters and for all those other uses, but can we have more schemes like the water transfer? Can we have more clean energy, other income generating commercial schemes that will help keep it alive? So it is on the radar. Come back tomorrow at 3 and ask Campbell the question. You'll get a better answer, because he's in charge, not me.
Thanks for that plug, Matthew. I was beginning to worry, sir, that you hacked into my laptop because you've asked one of my questions, that it will be me putting those questions to Campbell Robb tomorrow. And I think it will be a natural extension of a lot of the things we talked about today, about focusing on the future and what those opportunities are, and how exactly, as you say, how are we going to be able to address all of those? Where's that funding going to come from? On what sort of, Matthew's just hinted at it, that sort of ambition to develop fundraising from 6 to 60 million. Yes, that's probably game changing. To be 10 times higher over what time period? Over 10 years, that's extraordinary. And if that sort of ambition, and I don't know whether it is, if that sort of ambition is being applied to the other sources of funding through commercial development, then wow. I mean, it will be a bottomless pit, because it's a 2,000-mile network that's 250 years old. It will be a bottomless pit, and if you live in an old house, you've probably got some understanding of that. But it is almost game-changing, because those are huge increases. And if that doesn't start to solve the problems of the unplanned closures and stoppages, I don't know what will. So I think that stat that Matthew has given is one of the most exciting things I've heard for a very long time.
I think the fact that the room is so full today shows how passionate we all are about keeping our waterways alive for the generations to come. And thank you to Matthew, because you've somewhat been in the hot seat. But you've answered a lot of questions for us, and whether that's raised more questions or more debate or conversations, it can only be a good thing, because what it all comes down to at the end is that we're all on the same side, and we all want it to look beautiful and be just right. But we do want to know what tomorrow looks like, next week, next year, because it impacts our small businesses that are on the waterways, and it impacts people who are just wanting to go boating for the summer. Communication is key. But thank you, Matthew. You've been great.
Thank you. Just one example of where we're trying to improve communication. We have just recently published our 5-year plan, a rolling plan for lock gate replacement. So you won't just now cannot just see what's in the plan for next winter, but where we're thinking ahead long term, so that people can plan, particularly businesses, around what will be closed when.
Did you want to join in, Charlie? Or?
Nothing to add to that. Actually, we don't fundraise.
We're all melting. We're all melting here. I think you probably all are too.
Right. Okay. So it's, as I say, a bit of air conditioning would have been nice, but that's we're in a tent in a field in organisers.
Right. Next time, next year, yeah.
As long as it doesn't add to my bill, that's fine. Personally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panellists, Peter Johns, Tiffany Gale-Haynes, Charlie Norman, and as I say in the hot seat, Matthew Symonds at the end there. I'd like to say a huge thank you for coming, and hope you've all had something out of it.